My boyfriend looked up from his plate and said, "I caught feelings for someone I met out of town. These things happen." For a second, I couldn't breathe. I remember staring at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to laugh and say it was a bad joke. But his face stayed calm, almost relieved, like he'd just handed me a problem and expected me to solve it quietly. I asked him slowly, "While you're still dating me?" He sighed, like I was the one making this complicated. "Be mature about it." That sentence hit harder than the confession itself. Be mature about it. As if maturity meant swallowing humiliation, as if respect was optional and consequences were something I was supposed to spare him from. I told him, "I am being mature." He smiled then, relaxed. He thought that meant I would wait, that I would sit right where I was while he boarded a plane to another city to figure out his feelings with another woman. That I would be his safety net in case the excitement wore off. He didn't know that while he was packing for his weekend away, I was already making a decision he wouldn't see coming. When he left for that trip, he kissed me on the cheek. Actually kissed me goodbye. He told me he'd text when he landed. He asked if I'd be okay. I watched him walk out the door with a bag packed more carefully than he ever packed for work, and I waited until his ride disappeared down the street. Then I started packing too. By the time he came back, there would be a letter taped to our door. A letter with a name on it he never expected to see there, a name that didn't belong to me. And when he read it, I was told he nearly collapsed in the hallway. Because be mature about it doesn't mean let me do whatever I want. It means understanding when something is over and having the self-respect to walk away. I was 30 when everything unraveled, but for a long time before that, I truly believed my life was steady, predictable in the best way. I had been with my boyfriend for 3 years, long enough that our lives no longer felt separate. We didn't just date, we built routines, shared grocery lists, inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else, plans that stretched casually into the future because we both assumed we'd still be standing side by side when we got there. We met through mutual friends at a birthday party that neither of us really wanted to attend. I remember being tired, hovering near the kitchen, debating whether I could politely leave early when he started talking to me like we were already familiar. It felt easy, comfortable, the kind of conversation where time slips without you noticing. We didn't rush into anything. We dated seriously after a few months, cautious but optimistic, and moved in together after a year and a half because it felt like the natural next step, not a gamble. Living together only seemed to confirm what I already believed. We functioned well as a team, divided chores without keeping score, watched the same shows curled up on the couch, talked about trips we'd take someday, vague ideas about marriage, kids, where we might end up long term. Nothing was locked in, but nothing felt uncertain either. He worked in sales, ambitious and personable, the kind of man who could talk to anyone and make them feel important. I admired that about him. His job required travel sometimes, overnight trips here and there, but it never bothered me. I trusted him completely. He'd text me photos from whatever city he was in, call before bed, complain about airport food. Everything felt transparent. About 2 months before everything fell apart, his travel increased. New territory, new responsibilities. I supported him without question. When he came home tired, I listened. When he left again, I waved him off with a kiss and told him to be safe. Then he came back from a trip to Portland, and something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just subtle changes that were easy to ignore if you wanted to. He checked his phone more often, smiled at messages he didn't explain. When I asked what was funny, he brushed it off as work stuff and changed the subject. I noticed, but I didn't accuse. I didn't pry. 3 years of trust doesn't disappear overnight. Looking back, I see now that this was the moment the ground started to move under my feet. I just didn't know it yet. I still believed we were solid, that whatever small distance I felt was temporary, that the life we were building together was real and mutual. I was wrong. After that Portland trip, the atmosphere between us changed, in ways that were hard to name but impossible to ignore. He was still there physically, still sleeping beside me, still asking about my day, but his attention felt divided, like part of him was permanently elsewhere. Conversations that used to flow now stalled. He laughed at his phone more than he laughed with me. At night, he'd turn slightly away in bed, scrolling until his screen dimmed, telling me he was just answering work messages. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Relationships go through phases. People get stressed. Distance doesn't always mean betrayal. I repeated those thoughts like a mantra, even as something uneasy settled in my chest. Little things began piling up. He became vague about future plans, non-committal in a way he never used to be. When I mentioned a friend's upcoming wedding and joked about us someday, he smiled but didn't add anything. When I talked about renewing our lease, he said we'd figure it out later. Later became his favorite word. One night, while we were washing dishes together, I asked him gently, "Are you okay lately? You seem distracted." He dried his hands, kissed my forehead, and said, "You're overthinking. Work's just been intense." His tone was reassuring, practiced. I wanted to believe him, so I did. But then there were the late-night texts that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, the new passcode on his phone, the way he angled the screen away without realizing he was doing it. None of it was proof, just fragments. And fragments are easy to dismiss when you love someone. The real shift came the night he said, "I need to tell you something." We were having dinner, nothing special, just another weekday evening in the life I thought was stable. The moment those words left his mouth, my stomach dropped. Nothing good ever follows that sentence. I remember gripping my fork a little tighter, bracing myself without knowing for what. That conversation planted the seed of everything that followed. Not because he confessed right away, but because I felt, deep down, that whatever he was about to say would change how I saw him, how I saw us. I didn't know yet that he'd already decided to step outside our relationship emotionally. I didn't know he would frame it as honesty instead of betrayal, maturity instead of avoidance. All I knew was that the version of him sitting across from me felt unfamiliar, and the life I thought we were building suddenly felt fragile. That was the moment the ground truly shifted. I just hadn't fallen yet. When he put his fork down and said, "I need to tell you something," the room seemed to shrink around us. The clink of cutlery from a neighbor's apartment, the low hum of the refrigerator, even the light above the table suddenly felt too loud. I looked at his face and knew, instinctively, that whatever was coming next would split my life into a before and an after. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. He took a breath, the kind people take when they're about to say something they've already rehearsed. "I met someone in Portland." The words landed softly, almost gently, but they hit me like a blow to the chest. I set my fork down slowly, afraid that if I moved too fast, I might shatter. "Met someone," I repeated. "What does that mean?" "We've been talking," he said, "since I got back." Talking. The word sounded harmless, deliberately chosen. Talking how? He hesitated for just a second. Just talking. But I caught feelings, real feelings. There it was, out in the open. He said it calmly, like he was sharing an observation, not confessing to something that could destroy us. "You caught feelings," I said quietly, "for someone else, while you're still with me." "It's not like I planned it," he replied, already defensive. "Feelings don't work that way. They just happen." "So what are you saying?" I asked. "That you want to break up?" He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. "I don't know. That's the thing. I need to figure out what these feelings mean. If they're real or just temporary." A cold clarity settled over me. "And how exactly do you plan to figure that out?" He looked up at me then, almost cautiously. He invited me to come visit him this weekend, just for a few days. I think I need to go, to see if there's actually something there, or if I'm just caught up in the excitement of something new. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stared at him, at the man I'd shared a bed with for 3 years, who was now calmly explaining that he wanted to spend a weekend with another woman to decide whether I was still worth choosing. "You want to go visit the woman you caught feelings for," I said slowly, "to see if you want to leave me for her." "Don't make it sound like that," he snapped. "That's exactly what it is." "I'm being honest with you," he insisted. "I could have gone behind your back. I didn't. I told you the truth because I respect you." I felt something inside me harden. "You respect me so much that you're asking me to wait here while you explore another relationship." "Be mature about it," he said. "People catch feelings. It doesn't mean anything. I just need to figure this out." I took a long breath, feeling my heart pounding against my ribs. "I am being mature about it." He looked relieved, visibly relaxing in his chair. "So you're okay with me going?" "I didn't say that," I replied. "I said I'm being mature. That means I'm not going to scream or beg. I'm going to let you make your choice, and then I'm going to make mine." He didn't like that answer, I could tell, but he didn't argue. He picked up his phone, his attention already drifting elsewhere, probably to the woman waiting for him in Portland. That night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, thinking about 3 years of trust and how casually he was willing to gamble it. By morning, he had booked his flight, Friday to Monday, a long weekend to figure things out. "I'll be back Monday evening," he said. "We can talk then." "Sure," I replied. "I said I'd be mature." Friday morning, I watched him pack with more care than he usually packed for work trips. He kissed me on the cheek before leaving, asked if I'd be okay. "I'll be fine," I said. And when the door closed behind him, I finally let myself see the truth clearly. He was leaving to test drive another life, and I was done being his backup plan. The moment the door closed behind him, the apartment felt unfamiliar. Not empty, exactly. Just wrong. Like the air itself had shifted and hadn't settled yet. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door he'd just walked through, replaying the way he'd kissed my cheek like this was any other trip, like he wasn't boarding a plane to spend a weekend with another woman while I stayed behind, expected to wait calmly and call it maturity. I didn't cry right away. I cleaned. Slowly, mechanically. I wiped down the counter that was already clean, rinsed a mug that hadn't been used, folded a blanket on the couch that still smelled like him. My body was doing something steady because my mind couldn't. Every few minutes, a thought would surface and hit me square in the chest. 3 years. Friday to Monday. He said this doesn't mean anything. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A message from him. "Just landed. I'll text later." I stared at the screen until it dimmed. I didn't reply. By late afternoon, the shock gave way to something sharper. Not rage, not panic, clarity. I sat on the edge of the bed and asked myself the question I'd been avoiding since the night before. What am I actually agreeing to if I stay? Waiting while he figures out whether I'm enough. Competing silently with someone I never invited into my life. Teaching him that my boundaries were flexible as long as he framed his betrayal as honesty. I realized then that my calm hadn't come from acceptance. It had come from decision. I opened the closet and pulled out a suitcase. Not dramatically, not in a rush. I packed with care, choosing only what was mine. Clothes, shoes, books, small personal things I didn't want to have to ask for later. With every item I folded, the reality settled in a little more. I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was responding intentionally. That night, I lay alone in our bed and didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about all the times I'd defended him in my head, how I'd translated his distance into stress, his secrecy into privacy, his selfishness into confusion. I asked myself what I'd missed, what I'd excused, and the answer was uncomfortable. I'd ignored my own discomfort because I didn't want to seem difficult. I didn't want to be the woman who overreacted. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. If he wanted to explore his feelings freely, I would remove myself completely from the equation. No arguments, no ultimatums, no emotional performances, just consequences. I didn't need him to come back for me to decide who I was going to be. I had already decided. And once that decision was made, everything else became very simple. Friday morning bled into afternoon as I worked through the apartment with quiet determination. I didn't rush. I didn't slam drawers or throw things into boxes. I moved with the kind of calm that comes when grief has already done its worst and left behind resolve. I separated what was mine from what wasn't, respecting boundaries even as I dismantled the life we'd built together. Clothes came off shared hangers. Books I'd brought into the relationship went back into my boxes. Electronics, documents, old photos. I left his things untouched, exactly where he'd expect to find them when he came home. By the time the sun dipped lower, my car was packed. I made 3 trips to my brother's place, carrying pieces of my life up the stairs and into a space that wasn't meant to be permanent, but was safe. Each trip felt lighter than the last. When I returned to the apartment for the final time that day, it looked different. Not devastated, just quieter, like it was waiting. That's when I sat down to write the letter. I didn't do it impulsively. I thought about every sentence, every word. I wanted it to be clear, not cruel, firm, not dramatic. It took me 2 hours to get it right, to say exactly what needed to be said without softening the truth or inflaming it. When I finished, I read it twice, folded it neatly, and slipped it into an envelope. I taped it to the front door around 6 in the evening, placing it at eye level so he couldn't miss it. Then I stepped back and looked at it for a moment, feeling the finality of what I'd done settle into my bones. This wasn't revenge. It was closure in real time. Later that night, my phone buzzed again. A message from him. Good morning. Portland is beautiful. Weather's perfect. How are you? I didn't respond. Saturday brought more messages, checking in, asking if everything was okay. Then irritation crept in. You're being childish. I told you I'd check in. The least you could do is respond. That was when I blocked his number. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I refused to be pulled into a performance of normalcy while he lived out a decision that had already ended us. On Sunday, he tried calling from another number. I didn't answer. The voicemail notification sat there, untouched. By Monday morning, he'd found a way around the block using an app. I'm flying back this afternoon. We need to talk. This weekend made me realize some things. I didn't reply to that either. My brother asked what I thought those things were. I told him it didn't matter. Either he'd decided the other woman was what he wanted, in which case my leaving saved us both time, or he'd decided he wanted me, in which case he'd already lost me by asking me to wait. By Monday evening, the pressure spread outward. He called my brother, frantic, asking to talk to me. When my brother refused, the conversation turned ugly. He accused me of humiliating him, of involving his family, of blowing everything out of proportion. Hearing it secondhand only confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry for how it landed. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, I felt myself change again. Stronger, quieter, less interested in explaining why I deserved better. I didn't know it yet, but the lowest point was still ahead, and it would be the moment that finally stripped away the last illusion I had left. The darkest moment didn't come with yelling or tears. It came in the quiet hours after the chaos faded, when there was no one left to perform strength for. Late Monday night, after my brother had gone to bed, I sat alone on the edge of the spare mattress and felt everything I'd been holding back finally catch up with me. The shock was gone. The adrenaline had burned out. What was left was the weight. I thought about the version of myself from a week earlier, the woman who believed she was in a stable, loving relationship, who trusted the person she shared a home with completely. That woman felt impossibly far away. I wondered how easily someone could dismantle 3 years with a single conversation and still expect to be met with patience and grace. For the first time since he'd left for Portland, I let myself imagine what it would have felt like if I'd stayed. Sitting alone all weekend, checking my phone, wondering what they were doing, what he was feeling, whether I was being compared, waiting for him to come back and decide if I was still worth choosing. The thought made my chest ache in a way that was almost physical. That was the moment I broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. I cried quietly, my hands covering my face so I wouldn't wake anyone. I cried for the future I'd pictured so casually, for the trust I'd given so freely, for the realization that the man I loved had been willing to risk me without hesitation, then call it honesty. I questioned myself in ways I hadn't before. Was I too rigid? Too proud? Had I thrown something away that could have been repaired? The doubts crept in, subtle and persistent, whispering that maybe maturity would have been staying, listening, giving him the chance he claimed he wanted. But even in that darkness, another truth kept surfacing. If I had stayed, I wouldn't have been choosing love. I would have been choosing fear. Fear of starting over. Fear of being alone. Fear of admitting that respect had already left the relationship long before he booked that flight. The lowest point wasn't losing him. It was realizing how close I'd come to losing myself by trying to be understanding at my own expense. By the time the tears stopped, the room was quiet again. My chest still hurt, but my thoughts were clearer. I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Walking away hadn't been an act of strength in the moment. It had been an act of survival. And once I accepted that, I knew the next step wasn't about him anymore. It was about reclaiming my sense of worth. Not in reaction to what he'd done, but in spite of it. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it marked the beginning of something else. The turning point didn't arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a sudden revelation. It arrived quietly, the morning after I hit that low point, when I woke up and realized something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology, not for an explanation, not for him to come back and tell me I mattered after all. I made coffee and sat at the small kitchen table in my brother's apartment, watching the light creep through the blinds. My phone was face down beside my mug. For the first time in days, I didn't feel the urge to check it. That alone felt like power returning to my hands. I thought about the word he kept using, mature. He'd said it like a shield, like a way to protect himself from consequences, as if maturity meant absorbing pain quietly, so he could explore whatever he wanted without discomfort. But sitting there, alone and steady, I finally understood what maturity actually looked like. Maturity was recognizing when a boundary had been crossed and refusing to negotiate your self-respect back into place. It was understanding that love doesn't require self-erasure, and it was accepting that someone else's confusion didn't obligate me to stand still. Later that afternoon, my brother told me about the call he'd gotten from my boyfriend the night before. How frantic he'd sounded, how angry when he realized I wasn't going to come to the phone, how quickly his focus shifted from regret to humiliation once he understood I'd told his mother. Hearing that confirmed what my heart already knew. If he truly understood the harm he'd caused, his first instinct wouldn't have been to protect his image. It would have been to sit with the consequences quietly, the way he'd asked me to. That's when I felt it fully. The release, the clarity. I wasn't losing a relationship. I was exiting a situation where I had been downgraded to an option without my consent. And the moment I reframed it that way, the guilt dissolved. He wanted to talk when he got back. He wanted to explain. He wanted the chance to reshape the story in a way that softened his choices. But the truth didn't need more discussion. It was already complete. I didn't need a neutral third party to tell me what was fair. I didn't need proof beyond his actions. I didn't need him to agree with my decision for it to be right. By choosing to leave before he returned, I had taken back control of the ending. There would be no scene in the apartment, no emotional negotiation in the hallway, no chance for him to frame himself as misunderstood. He would come home to silence, to absence, to a letter that stated facts without apology. And for the first time since he'd said, "I caught feelings," I felt grounded. Not hardened, not bitter, just rooted in the knowledge that I had honored myself. That was the moment the power shifted. Not away from him, but back to me. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It unraveled slowly, painfully, in ways I never needed to witness firsthand to understand. By Tuesday morning, the reality of what I'd done had reached every corner of his life, and none of it could be undone. He came home Monday night to an apartment that no longer felt shared. My things were gone, closets half empty, drawers lighter, the space quieter in a way that made absence impossible to ignore. And there, taped to the front door, was the letter. The one I'd written carefully, deliberately, without rage or apology. I didn't see his reaction, but I heard about it later, how he stood frozen in the hallway, how his face went pale as he read line after line, how the final paragraph hit him hardest, not because I'd ended things, but because I'd told his mother. That was the part he never expected. He tried to reach me immediately. Calls, texts, messages from unfamiliar numbers. When that didn't work, he called my brother again, his voice frantic now, stripped of the confidence he'd worn so easily before. He said he needed to explain, that there had been a misunderstanding, that the weekend had changed everything. My brother listened once, then shut it down. He told him the truth plainly, that explanations don't erase choices, that humiliation isn't the same thing as accountability, that asking someone to wait while you explore someone else isn't honesty, it's entitlement. The next few days were relentless. He showed up at my brother's building, pacing the sidewalk, calling my name until the doorman threatened to call the police. He sent emails, social media messages, had mutual friends reach out, framing his regret in softer language. He'd made a mistake. He'd realized what he wanted. Could we just talk? I didn't respond to any of it. What I heard instead came through other channels. His mother called him crying, furious, disappointed. She told him she hadn't raised him to treat someone like that. That honesty without integrity was meaningless. That losing me was the natural consequence of the choices he'd made. That shook him more than anything else. Friends who had once sided with him grew quieter. Some distanced themselves entirely. Others stopped defending him once the full story surfaced. Not the version where he was confused and brave for being honest, but the version where he boarded a plane to test a new relationship while keeping me on hold. And then, 2 weeks after his trip, I received a message from his mother. She told me she'd spoken to him again, that he was devastated, which she said was appropriate, that he kept insisting I'd overreacted, that I'd punished him for being truthful. She told me she'd corrected him sharply, that you don't get credit for warning someone before betraying them, that I had been too good for him long before Portland. That message mattered more than any apology he could have sent. A few weeks later, one final email came through an account I rarely checked. He admitted what he'd done was unforgivable, that he'd convinced himself his behavior was mature when it was actually selfish and cruel, that he'd come back from Portland planning to tell me he'd chosen me, only to find the letter and realize I was already gone. I read it once, then I deleted it. The consequences had landed exactly where they were supposed to. It's been 4 months now, and my life looks different in ways that are both smaller and larger than I expected. I found my own place, not as big as the apartment we shared, but entirely mine. Every object in it is there because I chose it, not because it fit into someone else's life. There's a quiet here that doesn't feel empty. It feels intentional. I threw myself into work at first, partly to stay busy, partly to remind myself that I was capable of building something solid on my own. I picked up hobbies I'd let slide, reconnected with friends I'd unintentionally drifted from, and relearned what it felt like to make plans without checking if they aligned with someone else's schedule or mood. Slowly, the ache softened, not because what happened stopped mattering, but because it stopped defining me. Through mutual friends, I heard pieces of how his life unfolded after that weekend. The woman in Portland wasn't interested in a relationship, just the attention. He tried dating afterward, but nothing stuck. He still lives in the old apartment, paying full rent now, walking past the spot where that letter was taped every time he comes home. I don't take any satisfaction in that. It's simply the natural aftermath of a choice he made willingly. What surprised me most was how little anger I felt. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I'd won. I just felt free. Free from waiting to see if I was someone's first choice. Free from translating disrespect into patience. Free from the idea that love requires you to stay quiet while your boundaries are crossed. People have asked if I regret telling his mother. I don't. Over 3 years, she and I built a relationship independent of him. She deserved to know why I disappeared from her life so suddenly. He didn't get to control the narrative just because the truth made him uncomfortable. Consequences aren't cruelty, they're clarity. Others have said I should have heard him out when he came back, considered counseling, given him a chance to fix things. I understand that perspective, but the moment he booked that flight to explore feelings for someone else while still with me was the moment our relationship ended. Everything after that was just paperwork. The letter taped to the door wasn't revenge, it was self-respect, put into words. He wanted me to be mature about him exploring other relationships, and I was. I maturely removed myself from a situation where I was being treated as optional. When he came home and saw that envelope, saw his name on it, saw the weight of his choices reflected back at him, I'm told he nearly collapsed. Because suddenly it wasn't private. It wasn't theoretical. It was real. It was permanent. It involved family, reputation, and loss. He wanted to explore his feelings. He did, and in the process, he lost everything else. I walked away knowing one thing for certain. I will never again mistake tolerance for maturity or silence for strength. And I will never stay in a relationship where respect is conditional. That wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I finally chose myself.